Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Of course, I'm Ammon Hillman. Maybe some of you are not aware. He's been making some really big claims. Of course, many might have seen my last couple videos on the topic. You can go check them out. But specifically today, we're going to talk about whether Jesus had a kid with him that was naked in the Garden of Gethsemane, and something about drugs and bandages and human trafficking. So most people are probably going to be very skeptical when they hear that, but we're going to talk about the day. We're going to see the evidence for such claims, then we're going to talk about the responses. Then we are going to discuss the more scholarly arguments. We're going to go through a paper discussing who and what this passage is about. And but before that, before we get in some nice little notes here, first of all, we have our Greek philosopher starter pack, because of course we have to when we're discussing Ammon Hillman. We gotta match that classics vibe, that Greek philosophy, and yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about here, but we have Homer's Iliad, so we're prepared. Also, this is obviously a joke. I don't actually think I'm a philosopher, but anyway, so we're just gonna give a basic intro, the stereotypical understanding of the passage, just so we're letting you guys know what we're going up against, or what the typical position is. So this is before Jesus is about to be crucified, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples, and people come to him with swords and clubs, the chief priests, and they're like, you've done wrong again, and this is enough. You're done for this time. And Judas betrays him, and Jesus says, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? So that robber word's going to be interesting as we go on here. It says, day after day I was with you in the temple teaching. You did not seize me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. And they all left him and fled. So they all left him and fled. That refers to like the disciples, the people that were following him. And then all of a sudden it says, we'll go back to that later, but it does say, like they seized Jesus. Okay, that'll also be important for later. But then it says randomly, really oddly, very weird, kind of iffy. It says, even in this translation, a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. So what the heck is this guy doing with only a linen cloth on his body? Ammon's big shtick he wants to justify is that Jesus was doing some type of initiation and needed a prepubescent boy to do sexual things with while on drugs while Jesus was caught and crucified. On an even sillier note, if we look at the passage where this supposedly naked kid is, which is Mark 14, he was only naked after the crowd ripped his clothes off after running. If he has clothes on, then starts to run, and only then does he not have clothes on, well, then he was never naked with Jesus in the text. On an even sillier note, in Greek, right before there is the text about the young man in verse 51, verse 50 explicitly says, kai aphintes aton ephagon pantes, which roughly means, and having left him, fled all. In other words, anyone who was with Jesus before already left. So the supposedly naked young man mentioned later couldn't have been part of that group and was therefore never with Jesus to begin with. So now we're going to talk about the evidence for, I guess, just how to read this passage in general. So this is a article in Jets. I think that it has a nice little summary and of the differing views here. So we're not going to go through absolutely all of it, but I did want to show you it. All right. So first of all, who was the young man? In the article, he talked about some number of different interpretations. Oh, there we go. Look at this. All right. So was he Jesus? So I'll just read this article part to you here. So Albert Van Hoy, considering the similarity between this young man and Jesus observes that the naked runaways account is a sort of enigmatic prefiguration of the fate of Jesus. Both are arrested, both have something to do with a linen cloth of the young man, both escape their respective coverings, one by fleeing naked, the other by resurrection, that the young man in a white garment at the empty tomb in Mark 16:5 is depicted sitting on the right, the appropriate locus of the Messiah, as shown in Mark 12:36 and 14:62, citing Psalm 110:1, appears to further the argument that symbolically equates the two young men, the Niskos in Mark 14:51-52, and this one is 16:5, with Jesus. Gundry seems to agree as he asserts that the naked runaway's exploit anticipates the resurrection of Jesus, with the leaving behind of his linen cloth serving as a preview of Jesus's implied leaving behind of his own linen cloth, his burial shroud. Though neither young man is Jesus himself, together they represent him in his death, burial, and resurrection. And this, so now we're going to talk about the evidence for, I guess, just how to read this passage in general. So this is a article in Jets. I think that it has a nice little summary and of the differing views here. So we're not going to go through absolutely all of it, but I did want to show you it. All right. So first of all, who was the young man? In the article, he talked about some number of different interpretations. Oh, there we go. Look at this. All right. So was he Jesus? So I'll just read this article part to you here. So Albert Van Hoy, considering the similarity between this young man and Jesus, observes that the naked runaways account is a sort of enigmatic prefiguration of the fate of Jesus. Both are arrested, both have something to do with a linen cloth of the young man, both escape their respective coverings, one by fleeing naked, the other by resurrection, that the young man in a white garment at the empty tomb in Mark 16:5 is depicted sitting on the right, the appropriate locus of the Messiah, as shown in Mark 12:36 and 14:62, citing Psalm 110:1, appears to further the argument that symbolically equates the two young men, the Niskos in Mark 14:51-52, and this one is 16:5, with Jesus. Gundry seems to agree as he asserts that the naked runaway's exploit anticipates the resurrection of Jesus, with the leaving behind of his linen cloth serving as a preview of Jesus's implied leaving behind of his own linen cloth, his burial shroud. Though neither young man is Jesus himself, together they represent him in his death, burial, and resurrection. In the same vein, John Knox considers 14:51-52 proleptic. Is it then too fanciful to suggest that this apparently whimsical story of the young man and the linen cloth got into the gospel tradition because Mark or some early community saw in it an anticipation of the empty tomb with which this gospel culminates? But there is certainly a really interesting parallel there. So let's keep going, see if there's anything better here. All right, so Joseph. All right, so it says, an anonymous 7th century commentary on Mark was attributed to Jerome. And that's in the 4th, 5th century when he was writing, says, this is like the case of Joseph, who leaving behind his tunic fled in the nude. Whoever wants to escape from the hands of the wicked people, let them mentally abandon the things of the world and flee after Jesus. Jerome actually did compare the scene of Mark 14:51-52 to Joseph's flight in Genesis 39:12 to escape the Egyptian woman. Joseph had to leave his garment with her, and the young man who followed Jesus, having a linen cloth cast about him. When he was assailed by the servants, had to throw away his earthly covering and to flee naked. There, and then the writer says, there is no doubt some similarity between Genesis 39:12 and Mark 14:52. The Old Testament pseudepigraphal work, what is that, Testimony of Josephus 8:3, does claim that Joseph fled naked, which is used as that same word as the passage in Mark. Moreover, Genesis 41:42 in the Septuagint puts Joseph in a, what is that, stole, and the same garment Mark's young man in 16:5 was clothed in. and the linen cloth worn by the naked runaway, however, is absent in the Genesis account. So we're missing a linen cloth reference, but there is some word similarities there. Maybe Mark's making a reference to that. Herman Wagen therefore sees a Joseph typology in the incident of Mark. Joseph fleeing in Mark 14:51-52, and Joseph exalted in 16:5. He also makes much of a supposed allusion in the Markan account to Amos 2:16. Even the bravest among the warriors will flee naked in that day, declares the Lord. According to Wagen, that scripture is fulfilled here in Mark 14:51-52. However, there is no Don in the prophecy. Moreover, that Amos text has warriors, not young man. So the similarity in words are not the same here in Mark 14. Thus, the allusion is at best tenuous. Joseph of Arimathea, who wraps Jesus' body in the linen cloth. Thus, for him, the three incidents: the young man running away naked, leaving his linen cloth; Joseph, who shrouds Jesus in a linen cloth; and the young man in the tomb, now wearing white, are all held together by the name Joseph. So then he says, Joseph the Arimathean was indeed a Joseph, for as he had begged Pilate's permission to bury Jesus, so Joseph the patriarch had begged Pharaoh's permission to bury Israel, which cost him a troublesome journey. Now, just as a Jew could not hear the story of a Joseph who fulfills the pious duty of a burial under difficulties without thinking of Joseph the patriarch, so he could not hear of a boy who leaves his coat in the captor's hands and escapes without thinking of the same patriarch. The story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife being a favorite moral tale for the instruction of the young. Thus, of our three allusions, two are Joseph themes. But what about the third? Joseph was stripped, first by his 11 false brethren, then by Potiphar's wife. He was buried in prison and believed by the 11 to be dead. But in due course, he appeared to them as though alive from the grave, clothed in a robe of glory as the man of the king's right hand. He said to them, I am Joseph. But his brethren could not answer him, for they were confounded. Compare the women, confronted not, indeed, with the new Joseph in person, but with one who wears his livery and unable to speak, for they were afraid. A glance at the Greek Old Testament will show the exactness of the verbal parallel. The writer comments on this quote saying, there are problems with such speculations from Old Testament texts. The absence of linen cloth or white in the Joseph story in Genesis 39-41 for one, but even more, a lack of discernible purpose in Mark's making the allusion, if he did, renders this speculation also suspect. One tends to agree with Raymond Brown that some of this Joseph imagery stands at cross purposes. If Jesus is Joseph, then being buried by Joseph does not help. What about this one? Number 6. Was he a baptismal initiate? Much has been made of a possible baptismal allegory in the whole affair of the naked runaway and the enrobed reporter. Augustine Stock thinks that Mark was composed as a Christian Passover Haggadah, the young man's nudity and subsequent clothing in white signifying the attainment of new life and the donning of post-baptismal clothing. Thus, the nakedness and flight in 14:51-52 symbolizes dying in Christ, and the reappearance of the young man in white symbolizes rising with Christ. So, what was Mark doing? So, there's one opinion, which is that there is no obvious theological significance. It's just something in the text that Mark wanted to conclude for whatever reason. He wanted to put it in there. No reason to speculate about it. No, it's nothing, no fancy editing. But scholars, like we mentioned before, are highly against that. For one, it's Mark's writings is very, I don't want to say editorialized, but there are certainly special places where the stories are put, and there's specific words that are used to parallel each other. And there's all kinds of, it's very much in a work of art in some way. So he says, Mark is a carefully constructed gospel with a simple, non-duplicated linear movement beginning in Galilee, continuing on the way, and ending in Jerusalem. It addresses the larger theme of what it means to follow Jesus on the way, on the trip of discipleship. Mark has brilliantly interwoven a historical narrative of a journey with a theological discourse on discipleship. The cross is a way of living, not only a way of dying. The whole journey is the way of the cross. The structure of the gospel is as follows. All right, so you'll see here, it starts in the desert in the first chapter, then it goes to Galilee, then there's the blindness of sight passage, then in the middle of it, there's on the way, and then next, another blindness of sight, blindness to sight, I should say, and then it's in Jerusalem for the rest of it, and then it's at the tomb. So this article is arguing that there's a parallel. It's a work of art. Okay, so that is one interpretation. Next option there is that it is a short sentence with a big backstory. So, like, yeah, Mark included it in there, but it's just, just not much information, but there's just a lot that went on with it. So Lewis Johnson, he exclaims that the writer is, well, I guess he's just formulating some, I guess, theory per se of what's possibly going on here. So he says the situation was surely this. After the supper, when Jesus goes out to Gethsemane, he will not let the young host go with them. No need for this, dear lad. I imagine him to be a youth of about 18 or 20, to run into danger. He had better go to bed. But the lad's restless anxiety will not let him sleep. And after a while he gets up and runs after them, and arrives at Gethsemane, just in time to witness the arrest. And of course, that's why he hadn't been mentioned before, because he just showed up. And mentioning his own narrow escape, Mark is certifying the fact that he himself did witness the arrest of Jesus. And because he witnessed it and was on the spot with Peter, he is exactly the man, eager to see what the outcome might be, who would urge Peter to come along to the high priest's palace, where he knew he had the entry. The incidents surely all hang together. So he is certainly much more confident than most people, at least. There is problems with that. So one, this assumes a 21st century understanding of how the Gospels are written. Okay, so like we just assume almost that the Gospels are just like the simple, just writing down what happened in their eyes, and it's just like a journal article, just the facts, just the history books. They didn't describe things in that way. If you've seen my interview with Dr. Michael Licona on talking about why it seems like there's contradictions in the Gospels, he explains that there are compositional devices that the writers will use, that they might use something like hyperbole, and there's a whole long list of other things. But basically, that they had license in this culture. It was ethically okay. It wasn't seen as like lying, to change some of the details, either to make a theological point, to simplify things. And of course, we do this today as well. We don't always include every single detail in every time we tell a story. There is another option, which is that this is a symbol of failure. A symbol of failure, okay? So this article reads, the juxtaposition. Oh, if it wasn't already clear, this article, you can find it in the description if you want to check it out. The juxtaposition of the brief episode of Mark 14:51-52 with that of the disciples fleeing is telling. Following upon the betrayal of Judas and the rest of Jesus in 14:43-49, they all, which is like the disciples, they all left him and fled immediately in 14:51-52. So this word for fled, it's the same one used by the young man that fled. Immediately in 14:51-52, there is the account of a young man who was following him and who, when seized, abandoned his garment and fled. It is significant that this youth is described as having been following Jesus. To follow was what the disciples had been called by Jesus for, and following was what they had already been doing. Following is therefore a sign, a code word, an image trigger for discipleship. Thus, Mark is semiotically pointing to the young man as a disciple. The disciples followed. The young man followed. The disciples fled. The young man fled. Here, then, is the picture of the naked runaway. Followers have become fleers. The ignominious flight of this anonymous sympathizer serves in the narrative context to underline the complete failure of Jesus' friends to support him when the moment came. They had once left all to follow, to go after Jesus. Now, in the abandonment of virtually everything by the young man, even the shirt off his back, readers are being told that the disciples had left all to get away from Jesus. The motive of leaving everything to become a disciple had now become the disgrace of leaving everything to become a non-disciple. Get that? So they were supposed to leave everything to become a disciple, but no, they left everything to stop being a disciple. How poetic. Thus, the youth who runs away naked is the negative counterpart of the ideal disciple, portrayed elsewhere in the gospel. This was a reversal of the call to discipleship. With irony, then, Mark displays the naked runaway as symbolic of the total abandonment of Jesus by the band of disciples who fled to escape the baleful consequences of association with their master. Okay, so part B doesn't necessarily mean it contradicts, but we'll see how it goes. The shame of abandonment. So maybe this is talking about the shame of abandonment. So we're talking about the nakedness here, okay? But why recount this little scene in Mark 14:51-52? Had not Mark already shown the disciples to have fled in 14:50? Why then the repeat performance symbolized in the story of the young man in 14:51-52? In other words, like, what's the point? Like, we've already talked about these people that have fled. It seems everybody fled. That's already embarrassing. Why this extra point? He says the only substantive difference between 14:50, the fleeing of the disciples, and 14:51-52, the fleeing of the young man, is that the latter had an unfortunate wardrobe malfunction, okay? So he had a clothing problem, okay? But what's so special about that? This difference is not insignificant. The nudity, which is mentioned twice, so it only had to be mentioned once, but it was actually mentioned twice, so there's a significance to it, vividly points to the shamefulness of the abandonment by the disciples. Nakedness, of course, is undesirable and to be avoided. So there's 4 different instances where there's a negative connotation to it in Matthew, James, and Revelation. So this discomfiture in Mark 14 points to the disgraceful unfaithfulness on the part of those who had been called to follow, and those who had, at least for some time, followed. They had chosen shame over fidelity to Jesus. At the Mount of Olives, on his way to Gethsemane, Jesus had warned his disciples that they would all fall away in 14:27. Peter had protested that even if all fall away, he would not. That's verse 14:29. And the rest of the disciples all were vehemently denying their future faithfulness. This is right before they literally fell away. This cannot be a coincidence, okay? Yet now in 14:50, they all flee. Shame. The writer says shame. The most recent abandonment of a garment was that performed by Bartimaeus in Mark 10:50-52, a joyful jettisoning of cloak to follow. So the same word for following. So in other words, Bartimaeus, he follows, and the cloak is removed, but it's a happy thing. In contrast, here was a shameful shedding of linen to flee. That's in 14:52. I do want to comment here that technically Ammon's views here actually are compatible with a lot of this, okay? With that being said, I do want to point out that Ammon's representation of this describes this almost as if it is some like historical narrative, like some 21st century account that has absolutely no like editorial point to it. It's just describing what happened. But that's the problem, though, is that Mark doesn't write that way. So it is compatible with these points that are being made. At the same time, that makes the theory more complicated. And you would also have to argue that Bartimaeus, the same thing's happening here with the young man or child in chapter 14. So makes it more complicated, possible, but you still got to make the argument for it. The remainder of this paper will provide two coordinate pairs of statements. And I don't know what that's supposed to be, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B maybe, that synthesize the textual elements of dealing with who is wearing what and why. Mark, it must be noted, is unusually interested in attire in his account of Jesus' passion. Thus far, we have 1A, and I think this is supposed to say young man. Apparently there was a misspelling, or maybe it's like German mans. I'm sure that's nonsense. But anyways, it's the same word that we were talking about before, nianaskos, linen cloth. The linen cloth, okay, the young man's linen cloth is shed in shame during the abandonment of Jesus by disciples. Jackson explains. Capping the account of the arrest, the motifs, vivid picture of abject terror and shameful nudity and cowardly flight admirably reinforces a scene in which the thrilling emotion is the desperate impulse to save one's own skin, the mood of every man for himself. It points up all the more glaringly still the shame of the disciples' own flight in the face of their failure to accept the necessity of Jesus' passion. Far from being the pointless or superfluous addition, it is often condemned for being then the incident of the flight of the naked youth is in fact that in its entirety, both literarily and theologically crucial to the account of the arrest. So he's saying this is making a big deal, okay? How is the account of shame theologically crucial? What is Mark doing with this clothing motif? We continue. There's apparently a exchange of clothing. He says, the linen cloth, which is that same word that occurs twice in 1451 to 52. What is immediately striking is that the only other instance of this word in this gospel refers to the linen burial shroud of Jesus in Mark 15:46. So this is going to be big. We have a mention of this cloth that is being removed in Mark 14:51, and then we have it mentioned later. So maybe it's just a coincidence. Let's see if there's any parallels to see if it's worth considering. There are also the word occurs twice, so it occurs twice in both passages. That's an interesting coincidence. In addition, gumnos occurs twice in Mark 14:51 to 52 as well. So there's another word connection there. In this connection, one might remember that Jesus himself was stripped twice during his humiliation. Once when he was disrobed to dress him in purple, and again as the purple was removed to replace his own garments. So now we have in 1b Jesus' linen cloth worn in death. Here then is a clever narrative strategy. In utterly discreditable circumstances, the disciple is stripped of the linen cloth he wore, and a linen cloth becomes Jesus' burial cloth following an equally degrading assassination. Putting 1a and 1b together, one arrives at the first literary clothing transfer indicated by the arrows in these curious incidents. So 1a, the young man's linen cloth shed in shame during the abandonment of Jesus by the disciples. And then 1b, Jesus' linen cloth is worn in death. Very interesting parallelism. Seems like a lot of parallels to just be a coincidence. Let's keep going. In a subtle switch, the young man's linen cloth becomes Jesus' linen shroud. The garment of shame now buries Jesus in death. The garment is acting as a cipher, he argues, so much that narrative details are expressed for the sake of this aspect. Its explicit mention at the rest and its explicit purpose. That, of course, is not to assert that it was the one and same linen cloth worn by the young man that became Jesus' burial cloth. Rather, the garment is cleverly utilized by the narrator as a literary device. Neither does the literary nature of the narrative deny that there indeed was a young man who shed his linen cloth, and that Jesus was actually wrapped in one before his burial. The veracity of the events described should not be negated, even while we observe the narrator crafting a potent literary device for the furtherance of his theological purpose. What exactly the purpose is for this literary device in cipher becomes clear as one examines the account of the announcement of Jesus' resurrection in Mark 16, 1-8. So we're going to pause. We're going to talk, how does this work with Ammon's view of some type of medical bandage? It is technically possible that even though they were referring to two different things, a basic linen cloth of some kind, and the later narrative in Mark 16, and then in later Mark 14, it could have been theoretically a medical bandage. At the same time, in the text, if we're just reading the text, we see very, very little reason to think that they would be any different. If we're going to translate or interpret Mark 14 as being about a medical bandage, it would only seem to make sense. We don't have any reason to think that from the text that it was a different type of like cloth or material. So then we would say that, okay, so maybe Jesus, that burial cloth was a medical bandage, but that's like really odd. I would like to see some response from Ammon on how he would understand that. How would he make that defensible? So let's continue. Sheet of glory. In that account in Mark 16, we find the only other use in all of Mark on the word, or of the word nianiskos, which means young man or child, as some might say. Earlier employed for the naked runaway in 1451, and now in 16:5 for the enrobed reporter. This is a significant parallel. Why does Mark go to such lengths to connect one young man with another? He could certainly have called the reporter of 16:5 an angel. Until now, he has shown no reluctance to label heavenly messengers as such in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 verses, in light of the fact that the messenger at the empty tomb was, in fact, an angel, as attested in Matthew 28:2, 5. Indeed, there was more than one in Luke 24:23, John 20:12. So Mark must have had some purpose in being cagey and discreet. In other words, he's saying, hey, it was an angel, but Mark's doing something weird with the text. Why is he doing this weird thing? So it says, not that labeling an angel, nianiskos, was being meretricious, but you guys never heard of that word before, meretricious, and deceptive. So he's not saying that the person was being deceptive. Well, of course, that would be kind of weird. But he says angels have been so called in 2 Maccabees 3:26, 33, 5:2, and Josephus's Antiquities 5:8-2. I don't know what that means, but 277, and then the other text here, the angel of the Lord of Judges 13 is described both as agalos to theon and as young man. Tobit 5:5, 7, and 10, where Raphael is also referred to as agalos and nianoskos. And then I'm not sure what that text is, but either way, so there's all kinds of different texts where it's referred to a young man, but it's also called some type of angel messenger. The only reason for Mark's unique appellation, calling the angel nianoskos in Mark 16:5, then must have been to create an overt link to the other, and only nianoskos in Mark and 14:51-52. So in other words, he's saying the young man, it's different. So it's not, one's a heavenly figure, one is not a heavenly figure at the same time. He's using these similar words to make a parallel point. What would be the theological purpose of such a link? What was Mark doing? There is one other word that links these two incidents in Mark 14:51-52 and 16:5. The word is peribalo. So this is the one we talked about earlier, where it meant something, according to Ammon, something like wrapping around the bandage. And indeed, these are the only two uses of the word in the entire gospel. So once again, we have more parallels, as was also the case with nianoskos. Thus, the issue of clothing is foregrounded again. Who is wearing what and why seem to be a matter of concern for Mark. There is no linen cloth here in Mark 16. Instead, this last neonoskos is the young man is clothed in a white robe. So now we have in 2b, the young man has white clothing at the empty tomb. The young man had given away his linen when he ran away naked in chapter 14. And Jesus had been given that piece of clothing, that cloth, in 1546. So where did the young man now suddenly obtain a white robe at the empty tomb? Remarkably, there are only two uses of the adjective white, which means Greek for lukos, in the entire gospel, here in 16:5 and earlier in 9:3 at the transfiguration of Jesus, where he is depicted as wearing white garments. Mark 9:3 then gives us one more statement of who is wearing what. Jesus' white garment, the lukos, worn in glory at the transfiguration. Putting 2a and 2b together, one arrives at the second literary clothing transfer. In 2a, Jesus' white garment, the lukos, worn in glory at the transfiguration, mirrors the young man's white clothing, the lukos, at the empty tomb. Interesting. So, thus another nuanced reassignment of apparel is accomplished. Jesus' white garments become the clothing of the young man at the tomb. The garment of glory now is the young man's apparel. The combination of the two clothing transfers for 1 and 2 reveals a remarkable substitution. So here we are. The young man's linen cloth shed in shame during the abandonment of Jesus by disciples. That's the one we've been talking about all this time. Then we have Jesus' linen cloth worn in death. So you have the young man shed in shame, wearing the cloth, abandoned by Jesus, abandonment of Jesus by the disciples. And then you have Jesus who has the linen cloth worn in death. And then 2a, Jesus' white garment, the lukos, worn in glory at the transfiguration. The young man's, and 2b, then the white clothing at the empty tomb. So it appears then that garments have been exchanged, in a literary sense, of course. The linen cloth the young man wore, and that was stripped from, rendering him naked, covered Jesus' body in the tomb. In exchange, the white garment Jesus wore at his transfiguration now covers the young man. In other words, the runaway's garment of shame in Mark 14 becomes Jesus' garment of shame in Mark 15, and Jesus' garment of glory in Mark 9 becomes the reporter's garment of glory in Mark 16. A little switcheroo, some might say. So, restoration of failure. We are almost done here. Even though that is a lot of words, we're almost at our conclusion. Last bit, the final piece of the evidence. Restoration after failure. The young man's garment of shame buried Jesus. Jesus' garment of glory restores the young man. That is a restoration is clear from the position of the young man at the tomb. Pointedly, Mark tells us he is seated on the right. None of the other gospel writers give us this right-sided location of the angel. So the young man, the angel is sitting at the right of Jesus. What is the point of that? This not so subtle literary prestidigitation, that's another word, it's almost like he's just using words for fun, represents the rehabilitation of the disciple. The naked and shamed one is clothed, and this with the clothing of glory of his master, Jesus, while the latter takes on the clothing of shame of the former. Mark 10:45, which says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many," is therefore depicted in a more picturesque fashion. Jesus bore the disciples' sin and shame. This might also be considered the Markan version of 2 Corinthians 5:21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The position of the young man, now clothed in white, is on the right, the rightful position of the Son of God. a position Mark wants his readers to understand, that is now shared by the enrobed reporter who was once, symbolically, a shameful, naked runaway. In sum, the art of the narrator paints a remarkable picture. The fleeing young man, symbolic of the disciples who had abandoned Jesus and had themselves fled, escapes shamefully naked, leaving behind a linen cloth that buried Jesus. That is what the master was given by a disciple, a garment of shame. But at the resurrection, there is a young man, sitting on the right, no less, and clothed gloriously in a white robe that Jesus had worn at his transfiguration. That is what the disciple is given by the master, a garment of glory. This artistic portrayal of the exchange of garments bears an implicit promise. There is hope for disciples who have failed to discern, to accept, and to be faithful to the mission of Jesus. There is hope for all who will follow Jesus on this Markan trip of discipleship, albeit stumbling and failing, clumsy and hesitant. Because of what Christ did, the shame is exchanged for glory. Yes, there is hope indeed. And it says the specific and seemingly redundant mention of Peter, where it says, tell his disciples, and even Peter, in Mark 16:7. And the command of the young man to the woman at the empty tomb was to remind that disciple and the rest of Mark's readers that failure was not a dead end. There would be forgiveness, there would be restoration, there is hope for those who have failed in their discipleship. Those who had shamefully abandoned Jesus and equally disgracefully denied him were now being offered to the hope of restoration. So, interesting view there. What do you guys think? If you want to be real productive with your commenting time, what I'd like to see is responses to the arguments that I've made, to the scholars that I've cited. How does, if you're a fan of Ammon, how does these arguments work with his view? What is the evidence for his view? What is he and all the other scholars out there, from atheist to Christian, what are they all missing that Ammon knows? Okay. Anyways, it's been fun. Long video. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your comments. Like and subscribe if you found value in this. Make sure to check out the other video where we commented on the debate between Kip Davis and Ammon Hillman. Make sure to check out my video on who Ammon Hillman is. Why did he get kicked out of his school? Why did they think he might have been demon possessed? You can check that out on the video. Thanks, guys. It's been fun. I'll see you later. Of the disciple. The naked and shamed one is clothed, and this with the clothing of glory of his master, Jesus, while the latter takes on the clothing of shame of the former. Mark 10:45. Which says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, is therefore depicted in a more picturesque fashion. Jesus bore the disciples' sin and shame. This might also be considered the Markan version of 2 Corinthians 5:21. He made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The position of the young man, now clothed in white, is on the right, the rightful position of the Son of God, a position Mark wants his readers to understand, that is now shared by the enrobed reporter who was once, symbolically, a shameful, naked runaway. In sum, the art of the narrator paints a remarkable picture. The fleeing young man, symbolic of the disciples who had abandoned Jesus and had themselves fled, escapes shamefully naked, leaving behind a linen cloth that buried Jesus. That is what the master was given by a disciple, a garment of shame. But at the resurrection, there is a young man, sitting on the right, no less, and clothed gloriously in a white robe that Jesus had worn at his transfiguration. That is what the disciple is given by the master, a garment of glory. This artistic portrayal of the exchange of garments bears an implicit promise. There is hope for disciples who have failed to discern, to accept, and to be faithful to the mission of Jesus. There is hope for all who will follow Jesus on this Markan trip of discipleship, albeit stumbling and failing, clumsy and hesitant. Because of what Christ did, the shame is exchanged for glory. Yes, there is hope indeed. And it says the specific and seemingly redundant mention of Peter, where it says, tell his disciples, and even Peter, in Mark 16:7. And the command of the young man to the woman at the empty tomb was to remind that disciple and the rest of Mark's readers that failure was not a dead end. There would be forgiveness, there would be restoration, there is hope for those who have failed in their discipleship. Those who had shamefully abandoned Jesus and equally disgracefully denied him were now being offered to the hope of restoration. So, interesting view there. What do you guys think? If you want to be real productive with your commenting time, what I'd like to see is responses to the arguments that I've made, to the scholars that I've cited. How does, if you're a fan of Ammon, how does these arguments work with his view? What is the evidence for his view? What is he and all the other scholars out there, from atheist to Christian, what are they all missing that Ammon knows? Okay. Anyways, it's been fun. Long video. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your comments. Like and subscribe if you found value in this. Make sure to check out the other video where we commented on the debate between Kip Davis and Ammon Hillman. Make sure to check out my video on who Ammon Hillman is. Why did he get kicked out of his school? Why did they think he might have been demon possessed? You can check that out on the video. Thanks, guys. It's been fun. I'll see you later.